is Matthew Bliss. I'm the Deputy Director of Programs for the IGF, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development. We're pleased to have this webinar today on our guidance for governments, a first in series decided by our 56 member countries a few years ago as a priority, and launched initially at our AGM in October in Geneva, and more recently a kind of a refined version with a supplement and summary. Summary is in 3 languages. The guidance for governments, the first one is on artisanal small-scale mining, and we've decided we would have 2 webinars. Today is the first of 2 webinars to introduce the guidance for governments to industry. We're joined today by our panelists, Nicholas Garrett of RCS Global and his associate and colleague Dan Paget, as well with RCS Global, the authors of the guidance. Dan and Nick also did a thorough consultation over the past few years, and Nick will give us an overview of the process as well as the guidance. So you'll mostly be hearing from Nick today. Dan will be fielding and paying attention to your questions. Dan will moderate our Q&A session a little later. So I'll just start on a brief introduction of the IGF itself. The Intergovernmental Forum is a Type 2 partnership under the United Nations. It was proposed by Canada and South Africa in 2002. By 2005, 25 member countries agreed to commit to leveraging mining for sustainable development and poverty reduction. Since 2005, we've had annual sessions, or now what we call annual general meetings, in Geneva at UNCTAD. UNCTAD has graciously hosted us now for 12 meetings, and will continue to do so. 2017, October 16th to 20th in Geneva at UNCTAD. Please feel free to register as the time gets closer. The meeting is usually attended by over 100 government people, mostly from ministries of mines, Ministry of Natural Resources, but also from ministries of environment. Usually up to 50 countries, 56 countries, 44 at the last AGM were members. The Intergovernmental Forum is regionally well represented. You can go to our webpage and take a look at the members. There's a map that shows the distribution among the membership is quite diverse geographically. We do have a combination of developed countries and developing countries that have joined. All are committed to leveraging mining for sustainable development. You'll notice on our cover page that the guidance itself was a collaboration. Although it was published by IGF and our secretariat host, IISD, it was also funded by mostly by Canada and Germany, and obviously the RCS Global team were the main authors and managed the process. Took a little more than 2 years. That's the cycle that the Government of Canada has set up when we established the secretariat within ISD. The members can select a topic for guidance, and then in the first year do consultation and ensure the scope is well fleshed out, and then a guidance can be drafted and then refined over the course of a second year. We expect we'll be able to produce guidance each year, and again, this is the first in the series, and we're pleased to produce it. Having said that, as Nick will tell you later, we do want to beat this guidance up a little bit. So if you have any feedback or any comments, please do send them in to Nick or myself. We have a couple emails in the presentation, and you can always find us at our webpage, igfmining.org. Nick, if you go to the next slide, I'll tell the group a little bit about the IGF. I think the IGF really is still a unique venue for dialogue on mining and sustainable development for governments. And we conduct our business in a multi-stakeholder approach involving industry and civil society. Having said that, I think we can do a better job. Our annual general meeting as some industry and some civil society, but I think we can do better there. So again, if you have comments on that, please let us know. Is member driven? Although voluntary, when members request support from the Secretariat and from other countries, they do have to select a focal point. And normally, when they ask for a country assessment, the minister of the responsible authority has to request that of the IGF and assign a focal point. So it tends to be a lot of work for them once they ask for either technical support or in-country assessments. If you go to the next slide, Nick, for us, please. The work program over the next 4 years, as required by the funding from Canada, is broken down into 3 main pillars: engagement and outreach, the mining policy framework, and capacity building and technical support. The engagement and outreach is about member services, making sure members have some peer-to-peer learning opportunities, whether with regional fora or at the AGM. We're also involved with Mining Indaba in Cape Town, as well as the prospectors and developers in Toronto coming in a week or two. The mining policy framework is a framework of best practices that was established kind of from 2011 and adopted in 2013. It's recognized by the UN. It's also recognized by the G8. It was adopted by the members and accepted by them as a frame of best practices in 6 thematic areas: legal and policy environment, financial benefit optimization, socioeconomic benefit optimization, environmental management, post-mining transition, so mine closure, as well as socioeconomic aspects associated with closure. And then the 6th is ASM. So ASM has always formed a priority area for our members. And again, they've proven that by voting the guidance on ASM to be the first, they've proven that the members have proven that it continues to be a priority. In our last discussions with members since the AGM, in fact, 17 of our African members have said ASM is one of their top priorities and are looking forward to some sort of support, either building their ASM sector or in using the guidance. Finally, our members also have access to capacity building and technical support. The capacity building and technical support can be kind of a demand-driven training. We've been provided funding for up to 30 or 35 of those by the end of 2020. And so a country like Zambia can say, we would like some help building our ASM. Please support us with that. Just to take one quick step back on the mining policy framework, what our country's members can do is request an assessment of their readiness to implement the mining policy framework in those 6 areas. In which case the Minister of Natural Resources, Minister of Mines, whoever is the competent authority responsible for mining, has to make that request to sign a focal point. We just finished 2 of those, one in Rwanda and one in Mauritania. We're writing the reports now. We'll get those reports validated and publish the results. And on the greatest needs and main gaps identified during the assessment, we'll follow up with training with government officials as well as other stakeholders. That's it for the introduction. I think we'll leave it at that. You can learn more about IGF at our website, again, igfmining.org. We can field questions a little bit later, but I'd like to hand it over to Nick now to take us through the guidance and the process in developing. Thank you. Nick?
Great. Thank you, Matthew. That's very kind of you, and thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Nicholas Garrett. I'm a director of RCS Global, and I've led the team developing the IGF guidance throughout its life cycle so far, which after 2 years, we're very happy that it's now got published in January 2017. Many of you know me personally or know of RCS Global, of course, but for those of you who don't, just a quick recap. RCS Global is one of the world's leading responsible raw materials supply chain audit and advisory groups. Together with our clients, we work all along the supply chain in raw materials, making industry more ethical, accountable, and transparent. On artisanal and small-scale mining, we have over the years conducted significant work assisting companies, international development organizations, and NGOs to engage constructively with ASM. And we do so typically by collaborating with local experts around the world to work with companies and industry organizations to implement effective strategies at both the mine site and supply chain levels to realize responsible sourcing objectives and to help our clients demonstrate positive impact. This is our 10th year of operation, and responsible sourcing is our home. Over the years, we've often proven the expertise to work on ASM issues that fell beyond the consensus of best practice at the time, and we've committed ourselves to filling these gaps with empirical detail and expert analysis to create real-world responses to practical challenges. But today, I'm really talking to you in the context of our contribution to good practice in the context of this, the IGF guidance. Now, introducing the guidance, you can see the actual document featured on the left-hand side of the screen here. The guidance document essentially presents a step-by-step process for governments to develop, implement, and monitor an effective ASM management strategy. The guidance is the product of 2.5 years of work, as Matthew said, and we're obviously grateful for the support we've received from the various stakeholders that you can see on the right-hand side. And we anticipate for this to become a significant step forward in ASM policymaking, and that the guidance will become a go-to resource for governments and ASM stakeholders alike over the years to come. Equally, the guidance enjoys the support of a large and growing number of stakeholders. For example, the IGF's 56 member governments, the government of Canada and Germany, the OECD, and a broad range of industry organizations, which you can see presented on the screen. They've all, in one way or another, endorsed the guidance. And this is without us having asked everyone in the world. And we're obviously grateful for this strong support up to here. And we're looking forward to getting more endorsements in the future, and obviously throughout its implementation, because we're very much looking forward to getting the first feedback or actual implementation over the years to come. Now, as you know, this webinar isn't supposed to be an actual introduction of the guidance to just everyone. It has a very clear industry focus, because we want to highlight right from the start why this guidance is so important to industry as well. Now, some of you might be thinking, why does this matter to me? It's obviously fantastic that this resource has been developed, you might say, but I don't work in government. So what does this guidance offer to companies and industry associations? What can they use this guidance for? I'm sure that it'll take little to convince each of you that ASM itself is not only concerned for the people in the countries where it takes place, but for industry as well. While ASM, as we all know, presents a livelihood to millions of people around the world, it also presents a source of risk to industry. These risks emerge from 2 points of contact between industry and ASM typically. First, obviously, when ASM takes place in close proximity to large-scale mining sites. And second, when ASM production enters or is thought to enter global supply chains in minerals and metals. When ASM does either of these things, it can present specific risks. Firstly, reputational risks to mining companies about their conduct, and to manufacturing and end-user corporations about the origin of their materials and products. Equally, those risks can become commercial. If reputational risk make consumers choose either firms' products or downstream companies change suppliers, for example. Depending on the types of ASM issues that companies become associated with and the degree of exposure, they can find themselves facing legal risks. They fall foul of extraterritorial legislation, for example, or market due diligence requirements. For upstream companies in particular, the proximity of ASM close to operational sites can cause operational risks. Companies' operations can be interrupted or even impeded by recurrent ASM issues near their operations. Now, the root of ASM risk. Why does ASM present these risks when it comes into contact with industry? Well, principally because it generates so many negative impacts, which become connected to industry. ASM, while obviously also having significant development potential, and the guidance is very much written in that spirit, it is at the same time, though, also tied up variously with child labor, mercury pollution, exploitation, health and safety issues, conflict, money laundering, and a long list of risks and impacts that I know you will all be familiar with. It is these issues that make ASM a source of risk to companies. The problem isn't that large-scale mining companies have neighbors, for example. Problems arise if they're not reasonably well-behaved neighbors. Likewise, the problem for industry supply chains isn't that they may or may not be ASM-produced materials per se entering these supply chains. It's a problem if ASM-produced materials enter global supply chains and do not comply with standards of good practice and market requirements. Now, the question is, why does ASM generate so many negative impacts? We believe that one key factor is that it is often poorly regulated and managed by government. Some of the negative impacts ASM generates results from ignorance, lack of capital, or a desire to control costs, perhaps. What separates ASM operations that generate negative impacts from those that don't often is how they're regulated and managed by government. Of course, we know that ill-guided practices can be found all over the world. In fact, it's so much easier to find bad practice than to find good practice. Whether it is police suppression of ASM, look the other way of enforcement, no questions asked gold buying, or state predation on ASM activities, poorly designed, implemented, or enforced strategies are commonplace and underpin many of these bad practices. The ASM management guidance primarily helps to design, implement, and enforce better strategies. Now, let's have a look at existing resources and how this ASM management guidance is a missing piece of the puzzle. Industry stakeholders tuning into this webinar you'll obviously be familiar with an array of documents concerning ASM. Many of you might be thinking, not just another document, please. Many of these documents offer guidelines or standards about how industry participants can manage the risk presented by ASM. Some of the documents consider ways that industries and ASM can endeavor to prosper together. However, few of these documents or initiatives focus on a key root of ASM risks: government action and inaction as far as poorly designed, implemented, or enforced government policies are concerned. In fact, there have been remarkably few resources that inform what process governments should attempt to follow to design, implement, and enforce policies that will help ASM to prosper, mitigate ASM-LSM conflicts, and/or ensure ASM meets the requirements of downstream responsible sourcing efforts worldwide. The few that do exist are research documents or profiles of policy tools, or are in fact not publicly available documents. Equally, they're often out of date. They were written before recent sea changes in good practice. Consider for a moment just how much ideas about ASM-LSM partnerships have moved on in the last 15 years. Think how much due diligence and chain of custody standards have been remolded into mainstream responsible sourcing efforts since 2010. And think about how little this is reflected in some of the older documents that speak on ASM and that are still in use and in circulation. Now, the guidance is intended to fill that specific gap in existing resources and advance good practice in light of these new realities. It therefore complements existing guidance and does not compete with it at all, and that is also not the intention of it. It was written with the express aim of offering tailored advice to governments. Of course, the task of developing a government strategy to manage ASM is very different from these other resources. Many of the other resources deal with more digestible sets of objectives like reduce mercury use or improve health and safety standards or protect human rights. No matter how challenging the task, the concrete goals bring clarity to these tasks. Governments, on the other hand, don't really enjoy that luxury. In fact, governments have to learn to simultaneously pursue almost all of the goals that these documents entertain separately. They have to balance these competing demands upon their resources and efforts. This brings great complexity to ASM policymaking and management led by government. In this webinar, I'm going to illustrate the various ways in which the guidance helps to bring order to this complexity. It profiles various instruments that governments can use to address its problems, yes, but it also presents a series of decision-making processes that guide governments, which they should use, depending upon circumstance, of course. Equipped with this document, therefore, governments can improve ASM management, reduce negative impacts, and go to the root of the risks that companies face from ASM every day. Now, why is the guidance important for industry? It's quite a text-heavy slide, but I'll quickly lead you through it. So in a moment, we'll get to some of the content of the guidance. But first, I would like to ask yourselves listening in, are you beginning to imagine how you might use this document? For those of you from companies with mining sites close to ASM operations, for those of you representing downstream businesses that source materials that could be from ASM, has the potential of this document really struck you? By the end of this webinar, I hope I will have convinced you that it is very much relevant. And in particular, the guidance represents a significant new tool for companies and downstream businesses when coordinating and collaborating with host governments, when strengthening their engagement with ASM, when managing their ASM-related risks and demonstrating their ASM-related impact, particularly in the responsible sourcing context. With the endorsement of nearly all governments with a recognized ASM sector, the guidance is set to become a trusted blueprint for the management and regulation of ASM sectors globally. Companies can thus introduce the guidance to governments as a means to encourage them to think or rethink ASM policy. It lays out a blue skies, multi-stakeholder process to develop a new strategy to manage ASM. Therefore, it is a potential vehicle for change. Companies can use the guidance to steer ASM policymaking in a multi-stakeholder context and advocate approaches that they prefer. The guidance packs in existing and newly developed good practice in ASM management. As you read it, you will realize that it addresses how governments manage and mitigate a number of negative impacts of ASM, which are relevant to industry, whether they be issues of ASM trespassing on mining sites or into mining operations, or connections between human rights violations upstream and industry supply chain contamination, which is an issue for downstream companies. Equally, the guidance dedicates substantial time to addressing how the government should engage with other actors, including industry, and for what purpose. It offers advice about what government should hope to achieve in this engagement and in what phase in the process it should do so. Companies can use the guidance to inform when and about what they should engage governments. In other words, the guidance can help to structure government engagement. Using the guidance, therefore, can help provide more predictable, reliable, and responsible sourcing and CSR engagement environments for mining companies and mineral traders, refiners, and manufacturers, and as well as global brands. Now, briefly going into the development process of the guidance. The guidance obviously offers advice, but you might ask, where does the authority of this advice come from? Why should governments take notice of the guidance or respect the counsel laid out in it? The answer to these questions is in the process of its development. This is equally relevant to those who thought that 2 years of development is a long time. The guidance was developed through a long and multi-stakeholder process, which you can see in the diagram on the slide. To accommodate stakeholder feedback, we worked with the IGF for more than 2 years to develop the guidance. In fact, the first conversation I had with the Canadian government about this guidance was in the context of the OECD conference in Paris in the year 2012. The development of the guidance took on an iterative process. These highlighted segments each represent periods in which the guidance was extensively developed and revised. Each of those processes, in turn, involved multiple processes of drafting, review, and revision in-house. Our team worked to advance the boundaries of good practice and repeated efforts, each time building up on our previous achievements and insights. Equally, the process by which the guidance was developed included open stakeholder consultations and was highly participatory. We held 3 workshops on 3 different continents with diverse sets of participants from across the globe. We held several rounds of open public consultations during which we solicited and received detailed feedback from a wide range of experts and practitioners. In short, our guidance bears not just the authority and insight of the authors, it draws upon the expertise and insights of stakeholders from around the world who have contributed to its development. And for that, we're obviously very grateful. In terms of next steps, and I will refer back to Matthew later after my presentation here, it is the clear intention that this guidance is not just another document that either lives on the internet or in drawers where it gathers dust. This year, RCS Global will be leading a new phase in the guidance's promulgation. Not only are we conducting these 2 webinars for industry participants, so this is the first one, there will be another one post-PDAC, but the IGF is also contracting us to undertake a trial training of trainers program to build local capacity on the guidance. We'll convene invite-only regional workshops. These 2 or 3 day events targeted at local experts only will be designed to build local capacity and impart knowledge about the guidance to local experts from across the regions in question or across the regions of implementation. Workshop participants will become, in effect, ambassadors for the guidance. They will carry the insights from the guidance and the document itself to other stakeholders, and most importantly, to government. In this way, we will be working with the IGF to make the guidance not just a document that sits on a shelf, but as Matthew said, we will really help at getting beat up and gathering dirt. And hopefully this process will get us some serious feedback and help us shape it into an even better document over the years to come. That's on process. Now into the structure of the guidance. Let's present some of the content. Now, the guidance is a comprehensive and detailed document, so I can't walk you through each part here. Instead, I'm going to offer an overview of the document as well as a taste of the contents in depth. In the process, I will plug out aspects of the guidance that are particularly relevant to companies. The guidance is organized as a step-by-step process which governments can use at each consecutive stage in managing ASM. The content of the guidance is structured in 3 parts, which refer to the 3 phases of managing ASM. Very simply, in part 1, the guidance advises users on what a government should do before it even develops an ASM management strategy. Part 2 advises users how to develop an ASM management strategy, a coherent plan that includes what its goals are and which policy instruments it will use to meet these goals. Part 3 advises users how the government should implement that strategy, including obviously how to monitor it. Now, first of all, let me introduce you to part 1. First and foremost, we asked the government to decide what government bodies should be responsible for coordinating ASM management. ASM management often draws in as many as a dozen government departments. The department or cross-departmental task force needs to be granted the authority and responsibility to coordinate government efforts. The guidance recommends that governments conduct a proper analysis of the ASM context, research in other words. It outlines in detail what constitutes sufficient research to form the basis for subsequent ASM management strategy development. We recommend that government establish a forum through which interested parties and government can engage in dialogue. I want to draw your attention to this aspect of part 1 in particular. In the guidance, we offer detailed advice about the form that stakeholder engagement ought to take, the regularity of consultation, its effects upon policymaking, rules about who to include, and the issues discussed. Taking consultation seriously and doing it well are causes championed by the guidance. For companies that wish to engage with government more, the guidance is a potential tool to persuade government to think again about stakeholder consultation and how it takes place. However, above and beyond consultation, it also underlines the importance of partnership between the government and other relevant actors. I want to draw your attention to this final point as well. The guidance encourages governments to build an engagement with industry partners from the outset, building them into the design of the strategy. Partners differ from other stakeholders. Stakeholders are consulted, but in practice, their demands are not always adhered to. Partners pursue shared goals and bring separate resources to the table, so that each partner depends upon the other. This makes a partnership a shared venture, which differs from the relationships between stakeholders and government. In the guidance, we advise governments to seek to engage with industry on the basis of shared interests, like in any other good partnership. We discuss at length what mining and downstream companies might want government to pursue and what they might be able to contribute in return. The message, in short, is that partnership between government and industry should start early. It should be an early foundation of ASM management, and the pillars of partnership should be put in place before government develops its strategy for managing ASM so that those partnerships are integrated into government policy. On part 2 of the guidance. Part 2 of the guidance deals with the development of an ASM management strategy, deciding what actions should be undertaken, what changes should be made, and with what intentions. It's about linking actions with objectives. Now I'll introduce this in a bit more detail. It shows how the document turns the seemingly complex process of developing an ASM management strategy into a series of simpler, more manageable decisions. Much of the industry relevance of the guidance rests in part 2. Some of the points of the guidance that are most relevant to mining companies operating in country can be found here. Equally, it's the part most interesting for downstream companies, as it is here that due diligence and supply chain initiatives are most relevant to ASM management. The first step, or part 2 of the guidance, is dedicated to developing an ASM management strategy per se. And that strategy development begins with developing a vision. Now, a vision is not just an exercise, but a chance to choose and express clear goals, goals that strategy is designed to fulfill. Among the most important things that a government must set out in its vision is a prioritized ranking of ASM practices. This is what this diagram on this slide refers to. Now, the guidance recommends that governments follow the following process as part of the vision development exercise. First, they should compile a list of ASM practices, the techniques that ASM operations use, and other routine actions that have potential positive or negative impacts. Second, they should rank those practices from the most to the least desirable. Third, they should divide them into rule of thumb categories, such as unacceptable practices, poor practices, and good practices. A government can then draw upon these categories as it develops an ASM management strategy, and will return to these categories and their importance in the subsequent steps. Now, dividing ASM into subtypes and developing sub-strategies. Over the last decades, much time has been spent on developing elaborate definitions of ASM. Often, the attempt was to find some wording that is tight enough to fit into a few sentences, but broad enough to include the different types and facets of ASM. It's not necessarily a very productive use of everyone's time. Instead of trying to wordsmith a definition, we simply ask users of the guidance to decide what type of ASM they want to talk about. A common mistake that governments make is to develop a one-size-fits-all policies for all types of operations in the ASM sector. What we thought and stakeholders agreed upon was that ASM is made up of different types. The term ASM can be used to describe gold panners, small mechanized shaft mines, and offshore dredging alike. ASM includes diverse operations with different needs and that therefore need to be treated differently. What we advise governments to do first of all is to break up the category of ASM into smaller categories and then design separate strategies for each subtype. That is what the diagram shows of the different types, in this case X, Y, and Z. Now, as we developed the guidance, we found repeatedly that there was confusion about how to meet the various goals of ASM management. The most commonly mentioned and recurrent point of confusion was how to leverage the economic potential of ASM through, for example, technological or industrial advancement, alongside reducing the negative impacts of ASM. Sometimes these goals seemed aligned, and sometimes they seemed entirely at odds. We therefore advise governments to make it simpler conceptually by separating measures that are designed to nurture the economic potential of the ASM sector and measures that are designed to reduce the negative impacts of ASM. These two approaches constitute what we call the economic approach on the one side and the impacts approach on the other. We suggest that government develop two approaches in parallel. This avoids muddle and it clarifies the objectives of each government program. This will become clearer in the next slide. Now, this diagram illustrates what this involves in practice. First, a government should decide what policy instruments and initiatives it should employ as part of its economic approach from a menu of options. Second, it should decide what options it wishes to employ as part of its impacts approach. Once a government has decided what to do as part of each approach, they should integrate the two approaches into one strategy. I hope that you see the way that we break down singular complex decisions into small digestible ones in the 4 preceding slides. This is typical of the way that we make sense of the confusion and the incoherence that often besets ASM policymaking. And you can see obviously the different color shading here in this particular example where we chose different economic and impact approaches to make up one singular strategy. Now, let me speak briefly about an important aspect of the guidance offers about realizing the economic potential of ASM, the role of industry supply chain and due diligence initiatives. When ASM operations comply with particular initiatives and their standards governing production and trade, there are possible economic benefits. These benefits typically include access to markets which are legal, more stable, or in which supply is more constrained and so prices are higher. We advise governments to analyze whether the ASM sectors or parts of those sectors could participate in such initiatives, and if so, to mobilize the machinery of government to encourage both ASM operations and the initiatives in question to realize this opportunity. This diagram illustrates the steps that we advise governments should undertake. This is one way in which we encourage government to view industry as a potential partner. This is a good example about how the guidance shapes government thinking about industry and fosters an opportunity for industry and government to collaborate to realize shared goals. This is precisely the sort of material that industry can take advantage of in the guidance as they engage with government. Equally, industry can make specific reference to the section on supply chain initiatives in the context of their early engagement with government. There are obviously significant other references to various other kind of economic approaches that governments can use. However, we picked out this one as being particularly relevant to the audience of this webinar. Now, that is the economics approach on the one side. This is obviously now complemented by an ASM Impact approach as per the previous diagram. Now, an impact approach should strive to minimize the negative impacts and enhance the positive impacts of ASM operations. The government can do a number of different things to improve ASM practices, but which one to prioritize depends upon its own abilities and the characteristics of the type of ASM in question. Deciding how to approach improving ASM impacts is one of the things that governments most often get wrong. We represent the choices that a government must make in this decision tree. Now, first of all, a government should decide whether or not it has the capacity to administer a system of licensing and regulation. If a government can achieve this, it should adopt a license and regulate approach, circled in the bottom left-hand corner. If a government decides that it cannot feasibly license and regulate ASM, it should think what it can do instead. Our advice, very clearly, is that a license and regulate approach is best, even if it only involves government agents enforcing loose and permissive laws and regulations. However, trying to license and regulate without the capacity to do so amounts to hopeless optimism. Experience in the ASM context shows governments often don't know when to be realistic. The result is that they end up having firm license and regulate policies on paper, but soft touch, turn the other way enforcement in reality, or overbearing enforcement. Now, what we advise governments to then consider is whether they can employ some second best substitutes for license and regulate approach. And now these are not in any particular order of prioritization, but I'll simply talk you through two possible alternatives in the next two slides. The first alternative is using ASM Joints, which is an area that the German government is currently particularly active in. The government should ask whether it can feasibly set up ASM Joints, limited geographical areas in which it can successfully license and regulate ASM. Such zones are easier to manage, license, and regulate where ASM is clustered and there's an established government presence. Management is more difficult when they're in the middle of the jungle or in mountain ranges, for example. This means that government, which cannot realize first choice license and regulate approaches across the board, can achieve a feasible second best outcome by administering ASM in certain areas. This is a potential point of shared interest between governments and industry and mining companies in particular that the guidance can bridge. The guidance makes clear the potential benefits of ASM zones. If some government partners, such as large-scale mining companies, wish to support the creation of zones or areas in which ASM is strictly licensed, this is a potential area for future collaboration. Often in the real-world context, of course, this is prohibited by bad government policy, which essentially disallows companies to engage with ASM on or near their concessions. So this is why it's a future area of collaboration. The second alternative to licensing and regulating is to take advantage of the powers of market forces. And this is a very strong alternative, as we have learned over the recent years with the introduction of due diligence and other supply chain initiatives. Above, we discussed the economic potential of ASM operations selling their produce with the assistance of supply chain initiatives. That same economic advantage of participating in supply chain initiatives, the market access, can be used as a source of leverage over ASM operations. These initiatives require that participants meet certain criteria in exchange for access. Criteria that may be similar to the regulations governments actually may want to introduce. Governments, in turn, may find ways to add other rules too. Now, if a government can encourage the introduction and expansion of such initiatives, they can be used as demand-driven systems of regulation. In essence, governments can facilitate the participation of ASM operations in supply chain initiatives and thereby encourage ASM operations to voluntarily meet standards and regulations in exchange for market access. Now, these processes require collaboration between government and industry, both to harmonize rules and to ensure that due diligence and chain of custody requirements can be met by participating operations. They also require government to adopt a separate approach to ASM operations that choose not to participate. In this way, the guidance encourages governments to think of industry as potential partners and encourages governments to design their regulations not just with domestic concerns in mind, but with the sourcing requirements of industry internationally. By doing so, governments can both economically develop their ASM sectors and improve ASM standards at the same time. In conclusion, so why is this guidance relevant to industry? What can upstream mining companies and downstream manufacturers and end-user corporations gain by using the guidance? The guidance is a tool that can be used to improve ASM management, mitigate negative and enhance positive ASM impacts, and overall reduce risk for industry. In many respects, good ASM management by governments is in industry's best interest, as it allows for more effective engagement and the clearer demonstration of impact. This is also one of the principal reasons we believe why industry was eager to endorse the guidance. However, this potential is only realized if governments take the guidance seriously. Industry has the influence and the interest to urge governments to do so. Industry can also help governments undertake the steps laid out in the guidance. The guidance compiles, distills, and presents good practice for governments on managing ASM, brings together the learning of decades of research and practice and stakeholders from across the world. It's a resource of incredible depth and insight for governments and companies alike. Puts government-industry collaboration at the heart of ASM management. Lastly, and perhaps most pertinently, companies can use the guidance to tailor industry engagement with government. It offers structure, it offers focus on the particular issues, it offers process, and it advocates many measures that industry generally supports. This is the guidance, or at least the industry-relevant parts of the guidance. I would like to emphasize that the guidance and the supplement which accompanies it are detailed, but not scarily detailed documents. They bear great numbers of insights, only a fraction of which I've shared with you here. And many more insights will come from the actual implementation of the guidance and it being tested and implemented on the ground. If you have any immediate questions, we'll obviously attempt to answer them in the Q&A session. There is a Q&A function in this webinar. Please do provide us with your questions. Alternatively, you can email either Matthew or myself on the emails provided on the current slide. We will be more than happy to speak privately in more detail. Or we can obviously also accommodate your questions, if they're bigger questions, in the forthcoming webinar on March 21st, 2017. Thank you very much.